So what is mindfulness? Well, there's no one definition, but you could say it's paying attention to the present moment. But the attitude with which we pay attention is really important as well. So with an attitude of openness and curiosity, acceptance, self-compassion, because when we pay attention to the things and things that we like and find easy and pleasant and so on, well, that's all right. But actually the real challenge is to be present to and engage with the situations we find uncomfortable. So to just be as accepting of those, whether it's anxiety or depression or worry or fear, to be open and accepting to that is very important, because if we get reactive and know and fight and suppress it, of course, we escalate the very thoughts and feelings we're trying not to experience. So paradoxically, being open, accepting to the moment as it unfolds is a very important part of what it means to be mindful. So if we're just taking in the view, if you're away somewhere, there's a sunset and just in the moment, then we're mindful then, whether or not we're conscious of being mindful, but it just happens quite spontaneously. Or if you're in the flow of something that you're doing, an activity you're engaged with, then we're mindful then as well. If you enjoy something like wine, so this guy's practicing mindfulness, he's using every one of his senses to engage in the present moment, the sense of sight and taste and the texture and the smell and so on. You'll notice that these two are pretty mindful as well. They're not quite so mindful of the wine. Maybe he should lift his nose out of the glass and just have a look at what's going on around it. But anyway, when we're really engaged with what we're doing, then we're mindful then. This guy's pretty mindful as well. This could be Mick Fanning, I suppose, couldn't it? But anyway, it's not Mick Fanning, but this guy's being pretty mindful too. He's paying attention to the present moment for a very good reason. Now, I won't have time to go into all the details of the stress response, but occasionally we do need the stress response. If we're in a present moment, clearly perceived, threatening situation, our body goes into a totally different gear, all right? It's called the fight or flight response. Either way, it's an activation response. Our body activates. If our body was a car, it's like going into turbocharge. And that's to help us to get out of danger as quickly as possible. So the stress response, all of the changes in our heart and the distribution of blood flow from the skin going pale and the breathing fast, the whole thing is about an activation response so that we are quicker, we're stronger, we have more endurance than we normally have. It is not an anxiety response, it's an activation response. And every one of those changes in our bodies has got a rhyme and a reason to be there. So stress is good for our health if we're in a situation like this. Now, you've probably heard the opposite of that. I thought stress was meant to be bad for health. So maybe we activate this whole fight or flight response at times when we don't really need it. So has anybody here ever gotten anxious before an event? Anybody ever done that? All sorts of events, so I don't know, it could be speaking at a conference or something, or organising a conference, even worse. It could be a Richmond supporter before a finals game, if we ever get, into the finals, of course, getting stressed before that, or a whole range of things before a meeting with somebody. So we often get stressed before events. Do we ever get stressed over things from the past? Something happened early in the day, something happened a year ago, something that happened 20 years ago. Now, the question is, in this situation, we point to that shadow in the water and we say, there's the stressor. That's the trigger for the stress response. But in these other situations, before or after an event has even happened, where is the stressor? It's in the mind. That's right. The mind's imagining and projecting. We might have lived that stressful event 1,000 times before it even happens. Or we experience something and we relive it vividly in our minds 1,000 times, 10,000 times after it's already come and gone. So what we do is we generate stress out of thin air. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, present moment reality might be a soft mattress, a soft pillow, a warm doona. That's all that's actually going on. But in our mind, we could be totally somewhere else. The what-ifs and maybes of tomorrow, or the shoulds or shouldn't-haves from the past. And that makes a very relatively simple moment a very complex moment where we're activating the stress response when we don't need it, and that is not a turbocharge of energy, that's anxiety. Mind you, the same thing happens in anger and hostility and fear and depression. There's an inappropriate activation of that response. So 99.9% of the time we activate it, it's based for no good reason to be there, but because of what we're doing to ourselves. And we need to learn to be mindful, to pay attention to the present moment, because if there really is a shark there, then we need to fight or fly. But if we realise the shark's in our imagination, we're getting ahead of ourselves, or we're recreating a stressful event from the past, then coming back to the present moment will help that response to switch itself off when it's not actually required. So the long-term overactivation of this response puts a wear and tear on our system it wasn't designed to take. It's called allostatic load, so we get impaired immunity. It's a physiological wear and tear. So our immune system goes down, hardens the arteries, leads to heart attacks and strokes and so on, metabolic syndrome, the blood pressure, blood glucose, blood lipids, but the damage to the brain as well. So we get atrophy, we lose brain cells at a rapid rate. So these stress chemicals are toxic for brain cells. Our brain wasn't meant to be marinated in these kinds of chemicals all day, every day. And the areas of the brain that get damaged the most are the hippocampus, which is our learning and memory centre, and the prefrontal cortex, that's our working memory, executive functioning areas of the brain. Now these are the areas of the brain we rely on for making decisions, for managing difficult situations, for learning, these are the areas of the brain that we do not want damaged in this way, but there's only one bit of the brain that grows, and that's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is really great when we're trying to get away from a shark, but the amygdala firing off all the time, well, it gets bigger and it gets more reactive. So what we're actually doing is wiring the brain for more stress. The effects go even deeper than this. They go down to the DNA of our cells, and I won't have time to go into this in much detail as well. But you've got here's a chromosome, all your DNA in your cells, and on the ends of the chromosomes are these little caps called telomeres, and they stop your DNA from unravelling in the same way that the little plastic things on the end of your shoelaces stop your shoelaces from unravelling. And the telomeres seem to be very important because they're a marker of our biological age. The shorter our telomeres, the older we are as far as our DNA is concerned. And the shorter the telomeres, the bigger the risk of the illnesses associated with ageing, like cancer and heart disease and dementia and the like. Now, this is a study looking at carers. They were looking at the impact of carer stress. And I should mention an Australian woman by the name of Elizabeth Blackburn won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2009 for discovering telomeres, and this is her research. But she was looking at the impact of carer stress. She was working with psychologists, and they wanted to know, does it have an effect, not just on a person's blood pressure and so on, but does it actually have an effect you can measure down to the DNA of the cells? And they looked at how well or poorly these women were coping with these demands. They're actually mothers of children with autism, but they wanted to look at the impact. And they found that a third of the women were coping better than average. Yes, they had a lot of demands, but they were coping well with it. The women who were coping least well were 9 to 17 years older by their mid-30s, as far as their DNA was concerned, compared to the women who were coping well. Now, at least a decade of accelerated ageing by mid-30s, I would have thought was quite a lot, right? So this is how deep the effect can go. Now, why give you bad news without good news? I want to give you some good news, because I may not get through all my slides just because of being a little bit behind time, but the good news is that, well, if we learn to be more mindful, does that actually turn this around, right? Well, it's interesting what's been found, because it seems that that is so. Now, mind wandering and ageing. Elizabeth Blackburn, Nobel Prize winner. People with a low tendency for the mind to wander, that is, tend to be more present, have the longest telomeres. But the more a person's mind tends to wander, the shorter the telomeres are, right? Every time you're not paying attention during this presentation, you take another 5 minutes off your life expectancy, right? So please give me your very best attention, because more often than not, when the mind wanders, we wander into worry. Sometimes over big worries, but more often than not, we grind away on thousands of little things. What time's the conference going to finish today? I've got to fit in a quick shop on the way home. Will I go to the fruit shop and the supermarket because the fruit's better at the fruit shop? No, I don't know. I don't think I'll have time. Will I get a park that's going to be close? I don't know. How many courses am I going to cook for dinner tonight for the people coming around? The mind grinding away on all of these worries. And what it does is it puts this internal pressure on our system, because we're doing one thing that might be relatively simple in that moment, like just jiggling a teacup, but so all that's actually going on is very simple, but in our mind we could be creating all sorts of what ifs and maybes and so on, which is not helpful for our health. Now, there's a lot of interest in mindfulness, and this is probably the most important reason: a prediction of what are expected to be the developed world's 10 top burdens of disease by the year 2030. And that's how far ahead depression is expected to be as the developed world's #1 burden of disease. Then you've got heart disease, dementia, alcohol abuse, diabetes, and so on. And of course, within the community, on average, there are particular groups who are more vulnerable to mental health issues for a whole range of reasons. So anything that has an effect of preventing depression or the relapse of depression is very big news in healthcare, and I'll come back to that in a few moments. So let's talk about being mindful. Now, this little fella over here, he's very mindful, isn't he? Paying attention in the present moment, no mindfulness training at all. Hasn't read any books on mindfulness. The cat hasn't done any mindfulness training either. He's an in the moment kind of cat. It's a natural thing to pay attention. We weren't born distracted and worried. That's a habit we get into relatively early in life. I mean, the first sentences we formed as a very young child weren't, "Mummy, what do you think the retirement age is going to be 70 years from now?" Or, "Do you think I'm going to have enough super put away by the time I retire?" We weren't born worrying about that, but that's a habit we get into relatively early in life. And I do mean a habit, because, there we are. We wake up in the middle of the night, so there it is, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. And, it's not like we consciously decide, it's 3 o'clock, I don't need to be up until 6, I could fit in 3 hours of worry. That's great. I'll just spend the next 3 hours worrying. And then we get out of bed because the alarm's gone off, and then we go to the shower. Oh, look, I'll fit in a quick 5 minutes worrying in the shower. And I'll just cram in a couple of little worries when I'm walking to the wardrobe to get my clothes out, but I've got a really good half-hour block of worry to do on the way to work. So I can drive the car on automatic pilot while I just worry about how much there is to do today. We don't consciously decide to do it, but it's a low awareness habit we get caught up into. So if we start to practice being mindful, we're likely to notice how much churning and distracting and worrying the mind does. Now, that's not bad news, that's actually good news, because if we start to observe it, we then start to exercise a choice. Do I want to keep doing that? Is that where I want my attention to be? Or is there something I want to re-engage my attention with? Like the person I'm with, like the thing I'm doing, the car I'm driving, the shower I'm having. So to be mindful in the shower means to just feel the water on the skin. To be mindful while we're communicating with somebody means to engage our attention fully, to listen, to look to the person who we're with. So there are a lot of things that make paying attention very difficult these days. I won't say too much about it, but the more screen time we have in early childhood, the more attention problems we have later on. That's not very helpful. Screen time's not great for a developing brain. A developing brain needs interaction with the sensory world, making things, doing things, and so on. And of course, we live in an increasingly distracted world. You see, this is connected, all right? I actually think there's a much more profound disconnection that's happening, because we're trying to connect with people who aren't there, but we are connecting less and less with the people who are there. I was at a cafe the other day, between events down in the peninsula, and a mother and a daughter. The daughter was about 5. They got to the cafe, they sat at the next table. She got out an iPad, the mother got out a smartphone, and they sat there for half an hour. Didn't even look at their food, it was put down. They just sort of automatically just shovel it into the mouth. They were just interacting with their phone. Then they got up after half an hour and left. Now, were they connected? Well, I didn't see any interaction between the mother and the child at all. That's disconnection. And of course it gets worse, doesn't it, on a date? Anyway, I won't say too much about this, but just a few days away from all the usual screens and everything else, pre-teens, at the end of it, they can recognise more emotional cues. It's very important developmentally for emotional intelligence and social learning and so on. But just a few days away from all of that stuff at a nature camp was enough to significantly increase the ability to recognise emotions and so on of pre-teens. So Albert Einstein, any man who can drive safely while kissing a pretty girl is simply not giving the kiss the attention it deserves. So that was Albert Einstein's way of saying, do not multitask. I won't have time to go into multitasking too much, but this is an example of complex multitasking. Talking on a phone and driving a car at the same time. The odds ratio for a motor vehicle accident is 4.1. So we're 410% as likely as average to have a motor vehicle accident. That's about the same impact as a 0.08 blood alcohol level, all right? Texting while driving increases at 23-fold, like seriously impaired. There is a modern myth that we can pay attention to multiple complex things at the same time, and that's a myth. The human brain does not do that, and I am talking about the male and the female brain, all right? There is a difference between efficient attention switching, that is being very focused on one thing at a time, but very able to direct the attention as the needs of the moment shift. There's a difference between that and trying to do it all at the same time. If we're trying to do something while, and we're talking, it's just a superficial conversation at best. We'll hardly remember anything, or we'll be more likely to make mistakes on whatever it is that we're doing. So to actually decide at this moment what needs my attention. And so if, for example, we're preparing a meal or whatever and somebody comes up and they want to talk, we've got a choice. Is it, oh look, I'll come back to you in 5 minutes, I really need to get this on right now, is that okay? Yep, okay, we'll go back to it. Or leave that for the moment, yes, what is it you wanted to say? So to choose which to do. But whichever we do, it's much better if we engage attention properly for communication, for being efficient, getting through more work rather than less. But multitasking increases stress, increases errors, reduces our effectiveness, reduces efficiency. There is nothing good that comes of it. Anyway, I won't go into this, but if you're interested, Clifford Nass from Stanford's done a lot of research on kids. Kids are trashing their ability to pay attention these days with all of the media they're using all the time at the same time. I'm going to skip over that because the area of the brain that doesn't work well is our executive functioning area, and attention regulation, how we use our attention or focus, is the most important single executive function, because if we don't get that right, we don't get the other ones. So being able to engage attention, to be present and engaged. When we're not paying attention, we switch into a different mode. It's called default mode. It's the distracted, inattentive state of mind. So for example, if we're worrying, we're in default mode. Depressive rumination, default mode. Away with the birds, reliving the past, worrying about the future, default mode. These areas of the brain active in default mode, just for your interest, these areas of the brain affected by Alzheimer's disease, the more time we spend in default mode, the more the brain gets gummed up with amyloid, which is the protein that leads on to Alzheimer's disease. It's actually not a healthy state for the brain to be in. What the brain thrives on is engagement, is interest, is creativity, is interaction. That keeps the brain young. That's what the brain needs to maintain the circuits. When we're in default mode, all sorts of circuits are being pruned back because memory centres, executive functioning areas and so on are actually not engaged. So we don't just leave ourselves vulnerable to stress, we have a negative effect on our brain. Now, just very briefly, which of the following is associated with the greatest self-reported happiness? Multiple choice question for you. A, the mind wandering to unpleasant topics. B, the mind wandering to neutral topics. C, the mind wandering to pleasant topics. Or D, the mind not wandering from what one is currently doing. All right, so I'm going to ask you to vote for whichever one you choose. Put up your hand if you vote for A. Nope. Anybody vote for B? Nope. Anybody vote for C? Okay, got a few C's. You haven't been listening. Anybody vote for D? Okay, you'll be highly conscious of the fact I'm giving a talk on mindfulness. This was actually a study done at Harvard. People were at their happiest when they're just paying attention to what they're doing in the present moment. This was the concluding statement. In conclusion, a human mind is a wandering mind, and a wandering mind is an unhappy mind. The ability to think about what is not happening is a cognitive achievement, that comes at an emotional cost. So an achievement in thinking, if you like. It comes at a cost when we're disengaging, when we're distracted. So the issue is mindful or mindful. They're two very different things. And now, it's not a new idea, although it seems new, the mindful revolution, but this is a quote from the first major textbook in psychology in 1890 by William James. The faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character and will. No one is compos sui if you have it not. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. So there's a recognition of the importance of attention, but the skills in how to train it weren't widely known about or used, so it was just a footnote for about another century. Now this is a lovely quote from Murray Rose, one of the greatest swimmers of all time. And, how did you do all of this that you, like Superman kind of, that he seemed to be? Do you have any philosophy on life as an individual? Murray Rose says, I think it revolves around this perhaps secret of concentration on one thing. When you're eating, you do nothing else but eat. And when you're swimming, you do nothing else but swim. And I think that by doing that, you achieve the greatest satisfaction by devoting your whole self, your whole energies, your whole thoughts to just one activity at a time. And I think that would perhaps be the essence of my personal philosophy. And very simple, but profound words. I'm not going to go into this too much just because of time. But I'll just mention a scary list to you. These are the things for which there are clinical trials now. Mental health, preventing the relapse of depression. When those studies started coming through, people really started to take it seriously. There are dozens of studies on that now, but a whole range of other mental health problems as well. And then looking at neuroscience, it changes the structure and the function of the brain in the opposite of all this stress and default mode that I was talking about before. It actually stimulates new brain cell growth, new connections. It may be very important for preventing dementia and so on. Clinical applications, coping with major illnesses, dealing with chronic pain and healthy lifestyle change, so a whole range of health-related applications. Performance, surprising number of athletes and so on, and many others who want to improve performance. Education, without attention engaging effectively, without being present, open, etc., we don't learn very well. Relationships, more empathy, communication, and so on. There are studies on all of these things, but also for practitioners and carers who learn to be more mindful, we care in a more attentive and present, engaged way as well. And we shouldn't forget, of course, that the world's great wisdom traditions have been doing this stuff for thousands of years, so it's not new news. These are new applications. All right, so thank you very much for your attention.